welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show is a vicious vampire compilation. I hope you guys and girls enjoy these set of stories I've seeked out over the past few nights, trying to find some of the best and most twisted, skin-crawling, scary stories involving the bloodsuckers themselves. Big thank you to all of you who have subscribed over the last week. Been a huge increase, and I can only guess that's through the shares and likes, and of course the comments have been fantastic. And of course I do appreciate each and every one of you. Also been some fantastic things going on the Facebook group, DMT's Cabin in the Woods. We're like a little family over there, guys, and I'm so proud seeing people here and there discussing their encounters and, you know, being brave enough to even ask questions about that type of thing. You know, just being generally open about what's happening in their own lives, and seeing the support that branches out throughout the group and its members. Extremely humbled and very proud of that, and let's keep that going. Without further ado, let's get into tonight's first vampire story, and it's a cracker, this one. It's entitled Subject 49. Let's get straight into that. The prisoner was so thin, Huft could see the ghostly outlines of the internal organs under his skin. His bony hips floated inch deep in a puddle of his own urine, its acrid smell of powerful assault in the close quarters of the laboratory. Huft had also pissed himself the first time he saw the thing. Everyone did. Amazing, though, what a person could get used to. The prisoner's chin slumped forward against the chisel of his collarbone. A vein in his forehead pulsed, dark blue against his white skin. A moment more, and it was still. Note that Subject 46 expired at 13:42, Huft said. He turned suddenly and hurled his pen against the wall with all his might, splattering his assistant, Schmidt, with ink. "Where is Dr. Erlenbusch?" Huft growled. "I don't know, sir." "Of course you don't. Nor is it part of your duties to know where he is, because he should be here at all times, unless he's sleeping, as I am." Huft pinched the bridge of his nose where the storm clouds of a vicious headache were gathering. "Bring me another subject." Huft locked himself in a lavatory. One of the first things he'd done upon arrival at the camp was to relocate the lab from its original home at the bottom of the salt mine. Why they built the lab down there was beyond him, though he attributed it to his predecessor's incompetence. Huft had cleared out his warehouse, where they now conducted experiments around the clock. From his jacket pocket he removed a shaving kit that now contained a different set of tools: shoelace, spoon, cigarette lighter, and hypodermic needle, and a small glass vial of pure methamphetamine. He tapped some crystal into the spoon, added a few drops of water from the faucet, flicked the lighter, and held it under the spoon. The lighter was a relic of his journey through hell in the trenches of France. He rubbed his thumb absent-mindedly along the raised letters imprinted on the side of the lighter. An old habit. Gott mit uns. God had in fact not been with them, but it was plainly obvious that he was now giving Germany a second chance at glory it had been denied. He tied the shoelace around his upper arm and made a fist, coaxing a vein into bas relief. It reminded him of the vein in the middle of the Subject 46's forehead. He laid the needle flat against the inside of his arm. He had come to love its bite and its promises it held. He depressed the plunger and closed his eyes. They had not been informed who was in charge of the study. 6 months ago, a man named Frauhauf had contacted Dr. Huft with the offer of this position. A top-secret study at the prison camp he'd never heard of. An obscure Hungarian salt mine near the border with Romania. Huft had been suspicious at first. Why wouldn't this study be conducted at a facility with more resources? Auschwitz, perhaps. What a feather in his cap to work alongside the great Dr. Mengele. And Frauhauf himself was a mystery. The man had no rank, and did not say whom he represented. He did, however, write Huft the cheque that was going to buy a villa at the seashore after the study was finished. And then there was the meth. The pure crystal Frauhauf gave him was the purveyance of someone with real power. Someone who was growing impatient. Huft had thought it would be easy. The vampire would bite its victims, transform them, and he would study the process. The directive was twofold: learn how to make them and learn how to kill them. What could be simpler? The creature, however, had proved maddeningly uncooperative. It wouldn't touch any of the subjects. As far as Huft could tell, they all died of fright. In spite of many variations on the experiment, Huft had now made it to subject 46 without achieving the first part of his directive. If only they could be briefed about its history, how the Reich had acquired it, where it had come from, anything at all that might provide some clue. But Frau Huft was rebuffed this line of questioning with the same grim formality and abundance of cash with which he had met Huft's other inquiries. A knock at the door startled him. "Sir, Subject 47 has arrived." Subject 47 was going to be the one. He could feel it with every manic beat of his heart. Erlenbusch reached into his attaché case, the buttons on his jacket straining over his belly. He supposed it was inevitable. He was spending far too many hours at intellectual rather than physical work, and one of the perks of his position was access to some truly decadent food. Frau Huft had given him meth as well, but Erlenbusch hadn't taken to it the way Huft had. Coffee alone couldn't amount for the manic, hollow-eyed look the man had often these days. From the beginning, Huft had been tightly wound, but now Erlenbusch had to be careful not to say the wrong thing, lest he explode. Erlenbusch avoided spending time with him as much as possible. Not the ideal situation for research partners, but each was following a different angle that had a little overlap. Erlenbusch had tasked his guard Reichardt with finding a gypsy from among the prisoners who spoke German. The best the guard had been able to do was the girl who sat before Erlenbusch now. Rather plain, beaky nose and small bright eyes, skin leathery from long hours in the salt mine. He took out a chocolate bar and slid it across the table, then sat back and folded his hands. "Don't worry, I don't expect you to do anything distasteful." She reached out tentatively. When nothing happened, she snatched at it and hid it away in her pocket. "My only request is that you answer some questions, truthfully." He reached into the attaché case again and took out a small parcel, which he unwrapped in front of her as he had the chocolate. A hunk of soft bread, fresh from the baker's that morning, and a jar of raspberry preserves. When he looked up, the gypsy girl was drooling. "Tell me your name," he said. He cracked open the lid. The tart scent curled up between them like incense. "Mirella." She had a heavy accent. "I am Dr. Hans Erlenbusch. You have lived in Romania your whole life?" "Yes." "That's good, because I'm curious about something in particular." He toyed with the bread, drawing her eyes back to it. "I'm curious if you've heard stories about vampires." She drew back, lowering her chin and pulling her shapeless dress up in a move that covered her throat. "I have, of course," he continued. "Count Dracula, Van Helsing, back in the days when we were permitted to read foreign writers. Good for a scare before bed. But you, Mirella, you, I think, have heard far better. Tales of old women, to scare little ones. You're lying to me." He began to wrap up the bread. "No!" she cried. He stopped, folding. "Please," she said. "A simple exchange," he said. "Bread for truth." He made a mental note to write that down. He liked the ring of it. "Many things killed Dracula. Sunlight, steak, Holy Cross. These things." She gave a dismissive wave of her hand. "Real vampire." She closed her eyes and crossed herself. When she opened them again, he saw unguarded despair. "Real vampire not so easy to kill." At last! He was barely able to keep a straight face as he pushed the bread across the table to her. "Tell me." "Have you gone mad?" Huff shouted. "The most fascinating biological work of a lifetime has landed squarely in our laps, and you're off listening to gypsy wives' tales like a schoolboy." Erlenbusch lit a cigarette. He and Huff had this conversation before in varying degrees of civility. He had tried to make Huff understand, but the man was maddeningly stubborn. Huff had a lot of experience, but innovative thinking wasn't his strong suit. This type of work was a young man's game. Men like Huff were best put out to pasture. "Are you truly so backed up here you can't spare me a few hours a day?" Erlenbusch asked. "If you were ever here, you would know the answer to that question." Frau Huff expects a report on Friday, and we're no closer to our directives than we were the first subject. Have we ruled out entirely the corrupting influence of a non-Aryan blood? It's no more interested in the Aryan subject than any of the others. I've tried attractive women, pregnant girls, children. It wouldn't even come out of the shadows for the children. Perhaps it has a moral code, Erlenbush said, rather taken aback by the thought. Bullshit. It wants to make a fool out of me. Huft pounded his fist on the table. Erlenbush sighed deeply, expelling plumes of thick blue smoke from his nostrils. Huft was extraordinarily foul-mouthed for someone so prim. Give me one of those, Huff said irritably. Erlenbush lit a fresh cigarette from the end of his own and handed it to Huff, who accepted it with a little moo of disgust and Erlenbush's lack of couth. It's possible that we've been focusing too much on the purity of the blood, rather than the quality, Erlenbush said. All of the subjects have been half-starved and desiccated. It's an unfortunate side effect of our own candidate pool. But who will prefer a plump, juicy steak to a piece of gristle? If you're talking about fattening up the subjects, that would take weeks. Frau Huff would utterly shit himself. Surely Frau Huff wants results, and it takes a little longer. I don't have time for this. Subject 47 has been prepped. He looked expectantly at Erlenbush. Huft wanted Erlenbush to join him in the lab with that thing. Erlenbush had only been in a laboratory once. For Subject 1, though he hadn't seen the creature, its cell was kept dark. Huft told him it had severe reactions to light. Erlenbush had read the description of the creature, though, and the suggestion of it was in his mind when he entered the lab. He thought every shadow was a shape, but then the shape would fade away and he knew it was only his eyes playing tricks on him. The creature had ignored Subject 1. For the longest time the skinny Jew sat chained to a chair, eyes shut and cowering. Erlenbush thought he saw the shadows gathering into a shape. Was it a trick of the lights? Or did he see long fangs glistening like oozing needles? Erlenbush had excused himself to go to the lavatory, and there he stayed, smoking one cigarette after another. When he finally returned to the lab, the Jew was dead, and the thing was nowhere to be seen. Erlenbush had a nightmare that evening for the first time since he was a boy. In the dream, something was after him. He tried to scream and no sound came out. He tried to shut his eyes, but he couldn't. He heard gypsy music and ran towards the sound, but found himself instead pulled back, away from the safety of the campfire. He awoke in a fevered sweat, and for a moment still heard a few haunting strains of violin before consciousness blew them out like a candle. Gypsies! Why hadn't I thought of that earlier? Vampires and gypsies had always been intertwined in the stories of his youth. Erlenbush seized upon the idea. Here was an opportunity to keep working on the project when bowing out altogether would have been politically imprudent at best and suicidal at worst. He could conduct interviews with gypsies, could still be of vital use, and yet would not have to be in the same room as that thing again. Erlenbush put out his cigarette. I'll let you handle this one. I really must get back to my office. A muscle jumped under Huff's eye. Erlenbush pretended not to notice as he walked past him, out of the room. My, Morella sighed in frustration, searching for the right word in German. Not sister, boy, brother. Brother? Yes, vampire, take him. Father tried to stop it. He shoot, but bullets no use. Vampire bend father over his knee and break him in two, like toy. Vampire take my... Brother? My brother into forest. We look for him, but nothing. Then, when it's past 1 week, my brother come back to camp. She looked down, her lips trembling. Erlenbush took the opportunity to place a fat sausage on the table. The smell was marvellous, even to him. He could only imagine what it must smell like to the gypsy girl. It had the desired effect, and she resumed her story. Now brother is vampire. What became of him? I kill him, she said softly. How? Holy water. Erlenbush flipped back a few pages in his notes. It says here from our interview dated 10th of January that sunlight, stake and crucifix have no effect on vampires. But now you'd have me believe that holy water is the lone exception. I do not understand, she said, but she wouldn't meet his eye. I thought we'd reached an agreement, Morella. He was tempted to wrap up the sausage and put it away, using food as a carrot on a stick, had not worked so well as he had hoped. She obviously still felt the need to lie to him. He would have to take a different track. Reichardt knocked and entered. "Another message from Haft, I presume?" Erlenbush sighed. "Yes, sir." Erlenbush could no longer get away with ignoring him. "You may eat," he told Morella. He locked it in the room and spoke to Reichardt in the hall. Well, out of earshot if she would try to eavesdrop. "In a moment, I'm going to have you take her back to the room. But this time I want you to rough her up. Not so much that she can't still talk. I want her to be frightened than hurt." "Yes, sir." Erlenbush went back into the office. "All done. Reichardt will see you back to your room." She dutifully followed the guard, her eyes down. Still afraid of me, Erlenbush thought. If his plan worked, that would change. "Rough her up," Dr. Erlenbush had said. Reichardt walked behind the gypsy. Her absence from the salt mines these last few days had plumped her up, and her body rehydrated, but she was still bone thin. Her body made almost no movement beneath her shapeless grey dress. Someone like the red-haired prostitute from last summer, but just as weak, just as helpless. He took the gypsy by the arm and steered her toward the guard's lavatory. Once inside, he locked the door behind him. There was a small, yellowed wash basin with a mirror above it. He stood her in front of the mirror, as he had with the red-haired whore. "Look at yourself." His fingers bit into her arms. She gasped and looked up at herself in the mirror. He moved around behind her. He remembered how it had been with the red-haired girl. The power, the exhilaration. He took off his belt. Her eyes darted fearfully to his. "No!" in the mirror. She looked back at herself. Without warning, he slung the belt around her throat. Her startled cry was choked off. "Keep watching," he whispered into her ear. Her cheeks bloomed red as her blood vessels burst. Her lips moved in a soundless cry as she watched herself strangle. "So beautiful," he said softly. He choked her until she went limp, and then he laid her down on the floor, his breathing heavy. The whore had fought harder. His mates had laughed when he came out, asking if the cheap brothel had brought him a tomcat instead of a girl. The furious madam had insisted he pay extra. He didn't mind. He had never had a better experience with a prostitute, and he'd not had the chance to try it again until now. He reached into his trousers and finished himself off. "Thank you, Dr. Erlenbush," he whispered. Huff's hand shook as he picked up a needle, spilling the spoon's contents down the drain. "No!" he screamed. A moment later, a hesitant knock came at the door. "Dr. Haft?" Smith's reedy, obsequious voice. Yes, I'm fine," Huff snapped, and was gratified to hear footsteps shuffling away. Ass-kisser. Frau Haff had telephoned that morning to inform him that the progress was troubling. He'd been given a week to create a new vampire, or you will be obsolete. A direct quote from Herr Frauhof. Haft grasped the sink to steady himself. He lost so much weight, he was starting to resemble the subjects of his experiments, and his jaw ached from the constant grinding of his teeth. Subject 47 had been a screamer. Huff's nerves still hadn't recovered. He sent for Erlenbush several times, but Schmidt had reported back that Erlenbush was busy. Yes, busy fucking that gypsy whore of his. Haft was running on fumes, but he still had the autopsy ahead of him. All the subjects were dissected to see if there was some underlying medical reason the vampire rejected them. So far, there had been nothing to indicate why the creature should be so infuriatingly uncooperative. Haft injected a fresh dose into his left arm, which had seen less abuse. His right arm itched deep down and hurt when he inserted the needle. "Better," he whispered. Time to get back to work. Subject 48 was waiting. Something soft against her face. Her eyes came into focus. Dr. Erlenbush was patting her brow with a moist cloth. "I've been quite worried about you, Morella." She tried to speak, but could only cough a pained call out of her throat. Erlenbush handed a cup of hot tea with honey. She took a tiny sip. Swallowing was agony. She was laying on the couch in Erlenbush's office. He tucked a blanket around her shoulders. "How do you feel?" She patted her throat and winced. "Reichardt," his voice shook with rage. "That vermin!" The depth of his emotion touched her. It had been a long time since anyone had been kind to her. He was not so bad, really. She knew he'd been feeding her because he wanted something from her. But maybe he'd come to care about her all the same. I'll return shortly, he told her, and left to go find Reichardt. Erlenbush grabbed Reichardt by the lapels. Do you remember my precise instructions? For a moment Reichardt had no idea what Erlenbush was talking about. Leave her so she could speak. The gypsy? Who knows how long until she regains her voice? Maybe she can write, Reichardt said. An illiterate girl who's never been to school. Reichardt started to speak, but in the face of Erlenbush's rage, seemed to think better of it. I can have you at the Russian front by the end of the week. Reichardt paled. I'm terribly sorry, sir. It won't happen again. Erlenbush left him to contemplate visions of the snow, ice, and the lonely, frigid death. Subject 48 was one of the prisoners chosen to be a comfort woman for the guards. Quite a lovely girl, by far the healthiest of any of the subjects. She was the one of the few prisoners who had never set foot in the salt mine. They chained her to a chair and watched her for over an hour as nothing happened. When at last Huff sent Schmidt over, the assistant found that her neck had been broken, the first time the vampire itself had killed a subject outright. From her body temperature, she'd been dead almost since the moment they put her in a cell, yet no one had seen a thing. Huft shined in a light into the cage to make sure the creature was still there. It shrieked and hissed and curled itself into the farthest corner. Huft left the light on it to torture it and went back to his office. Its endless shrieking crawled up his spine. He ground his teeth mercilessly, mind racing, trying to think of what to do next. But why should the responsibility fall solely to him? Erlenbush, the arrogant little shit, playing when there was work to be done. Huft stalked to the door and threw it open so hard the knob cracked the wall. Schmidt! He screamed. I have a job for you! Much as Erlenbush was to loathe and to admit it, Reichardt's idea wasn't half bad. She might not be able to write, but Morella could draw. He fetched pen, paper, and a bottle of ink. I know it hurts to speak, but it's vitally important that I learn what I need to know. Otherwise, I might be sent to the Eastern Front. With me gone, there will be no one here to protect you. Reichardt will be free to do with you as he pleased. But I'm your friend, Morella. I've come to know your soul. You're too good to die in this place. The corners of his eyes glistened. He felt a moment of pity for her, trapped here and believing his lies because they were better than the truth. He decided to shoot her in the head when he was done with her. A mercy, rather than sending her back into the mine to be worked to death. She took the pen. Her strokes were crude, but there was no mistaking the scene coming to life on paper. A vampire with a girl in its arms. She patted her own chest. The vampire bit you? She shook her head and tapped her pen vigorously against the drawing of the vampire. Not the first vampire. Your brother? He bit you. She nodded. How then are you not a vampire? She held up 2 fingers. 2 of what? She mimed biting her neck and then held up 1 finger. She did it again. 2nd finger. It takes 2 bites? She nodded. But you only received 1 because you killed him before he could bite you again. And you didn't use holy water, did you? She drew an axe splitting the vampire's head into 2 neat halves. The hairs on the back of his arm stood up. All of his hard work, his patience. He took her in his arms and kissed her square on the mouth. Erlenbush strode fast over the frozen ground. He couldn't wait to see the look on the old bastard's face when Huft found out it was Erlenbush who had made their first breakthrough. He rounded the corner of the laboratory building and ran straight into Schmidt. Dr. Erlenbush, Schmidt said. I have a message for you from Herr Frauhof. He handed Erlenbush a telegram. Erlenbush read it and cringed. Get me a car, but tell Dr. Huff to postpone further experimentation until I get back. I have some very good news. Huff's head was pounding. He needed rest, but that was impossible with Frau Huff's warning hanging over his head. And Schmidt had just arrived with Erlenbush's gypsy. She was in better health than the rest of the prisoners. Time away from the mine eating decent food had plumped her cheeks and flushed her skin. But aside from that, Huff couldn't see the attraction for Erlenbush. She was very plain and had the coward manner Huff found so tedious about the prisoners. He knew the guards liked him that way, but then there was no individual initiative. They had to be told every move to make, and while that might be fine for digging ditches, it was maddening in scientific work. He was thankful most of his use for the prisoners involved them chained to a chair. They went through the usual pre-test procedures. She was weighed and measured, a brief history taken, and then they took her into the lab, and all hell broke loose. The vampire stood at the bars, nostrils flaring, its hideous features thrown into sharp relief by the lamp blazing directly overhead. Haft could see the network of black veins under its translucent skin. It showed no signs of distress in spite of the light. The gypsy girl uttered an ear-splitting shriek far worse than any of the other subjects. The vampire paced madly, like a dog that sees a squirrel running across the fence. The gypsy girl thrashed like a feral cat. Schmidt managed to hold on to her for a moment, but she clawed at his face and he let her go. In her panic, she ran right into the lavatory. "Schmidt, quickly! Bar the door!" Schmidt wedged the chair under the door handle. She would be trapped in the lavatory until someone released her. "Get the phenobarbital." Schmidt hurried out of the room to fetch the powerful sedative. It wasn't Huff's preference to drug the girl, but he wanted to get her into the vampire's cell with a minimum of fuss and trouble. If the vampire wouldn't bite her because of the drugs, Huff would simply wait it out until they wore off. Huff realised the vampire had gone quiet. He turned back to the cell and was shocked to find the creature still standing at the door, its long, clawed fingers curled around the bars. He would have expected it to retreat into the shadows, as it always had before when agitated. The vampire pulled the bars apart as if they were made of wet clay. Huff stared in disbelief. The creature stepped out of its cell and into the room with Huff, standing directly under the circle of light cast by the overhead lamp. The light didn't hurt it. The bars didn't hold it. Impossible. It could not have put up a ruse for 6 months. His mind was tricking him. Huff felt a puff of cold air blow past him, and suddenly his vision went white. The vampire was right in front of him, so pale it gleamed in a light shining from above. Huff's lap was suddenly warm and wet. The vampire opened its mouth wide. Long yellow fangs, smell of rusted pipe, fly-blown meat, disease. Its nostrils flared, breathing in the smell of Huff's terrified piss, as if it were the nose of a snifter of cognac. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the bite. But instead the vampire snatched him up in its arms, raised him high above its head, and then slammed his back down across its knee. Huff's spine snapped like a twig. The vampire dumped him onto the floor, where he lay gasping, his legs and arms twisted uselessly beneath him. He saw when its scabrous fingers slithered under his jacket, but couldn't feel them. He couldn't feel anything below his neck. The vampire pulled out Huff's drug kit. It held the heavy gauge hypodermic needle up in front of his eyes. It spoke. "You love the bite of the needle." The words were human, but the voice was splintered bone grinding together. The voice of the monster. Huff had never noticed before how long and sharp that needle really was. And the promises it holds. Huff began to weep. Without warning, the vampire rammed the needle into Huff's thigh. Nothing. No jolt of pain. Not even a twitch. The vampire pulled the needle out and stabbed him in the stomach. Huff felt nothing at all. It put its hand on Huff's forehead in a gesture that was almost tender. It gently turned his face so that he was looking directly up at it. Its eyelids flickered like a movie projector. The irises were dark, full of old blood. The pressure of its hand went suddenly from gentle to firm as it speared Huff through his cheek, piercing the fleshy gums and stabbing into his tongue. This time Huff felt everything. The pain was unimaginable and unendurable. He was completely immobilized, his body useless, his head held firm. The vampire yanked the needle out again, shifted its grip, and jabbed the needle through the soft tissue, under Huff's chin and into the roots of his tongue. Huff's screaming was like the shriek of a hawk. Rivulets of blood ran from the wounds, with Huff's head thrashing about. Some of the blood splattered onto the vampire's face. An obscenely long tongue snaked from between its lips to lap up the droplets. The vampire twisted Huff's head in his hands and lined the needle up with the man's ear canal. "No!" Huff gasped. "Please!" He tried desperately to move, but his body was no longer under his command. He tried to twist his head away from the needle. He failed. The vampire rammed the needle into his ear, stopping short of stabbing through the skull. into the brain. Huft wasn't allowed to die. Not just yet. Huft screamed so loud the vampire hissed in pain. It folded its ears back into its head to protect them, allowing it to do a much slower, more thorough job of pushing the needle into Huft's other ear. It was equally slow and deliberate in pulling the needle back out again. Huft's eyelids flickered. He was on the verge of passing out from the pain. The vampire pressed the tip of the needle to Huft's eyelid and waited, patiently, for him to regain his senses. Huddled in the farthest corner of the lavatory, Morella heard Huft's screams. They went on and on and on, and then they stopped. She looked around frantically for some way to defend herself. The door had a flimsy lock. No one expected the lavatory to be a scene of a standoff. She had to hope it would hold the vampire. There was nothing heavy enough to block the door. There was no good place to hide. Under the sink was a bottle of bleach. If it came in, she would throw the bleach in its eyes and run. She uncapped the bottle and waited behind the door. She waited there for a very long time. So long, she began to wonder if it had gone without realizing she was in there. Then, outside the door, "Let me in," it spoke in her native tongue. The voice was like ice water down her back, but there was also an invitation in it that was anything but cold. She realized her hands were on the doorknob. She snatched it back as if it was red hot. She pressed the heel of her palm into her teeth and bit down until she drew blood. It moaned like a dog. Her lips flew over the sour vagina. "I've been waiting for you." Its voice was soft and rotten. She abandoned praying altogether. "Why?" she whispered. "I can smell you for miles. You've been bitten once, but you killed your maker before the finishing bite. Your tainted blood cries out to be purified." Her hand found the doorknob again. This time, she didn't remove it. "Then why? Why have you waited so long?" "You will know when I've turned you. Let me make you strong. Let me free you. Let me in." She threw open a door and splashed bleach in it, dousing its head and shoulders. It wiped its eyes casually as if it was water, and it came into the room with her. It seemed to take up all of the air. All of the strength went out of her arms, and she dropped the bottle. Bleach spilled all over the floor, and the fumes blistering in the tiny room. It put its hands on her face. They were hot, like the fever of a disease. It pulled her slowly towards its mouth. "I don't want to die." "Then, daughter, you shall not." The first of her senses to return was smell. Something stank, and whatever it was burned her nose. She was soon coughing and spluttering. She opened her eyes, and everything was clearer, sharper, much easier to see in the dark than it had been ever before. She felt a strange heat in her belly, hunger mixed with a lust that was unrepentantly sexual. She could smell blood, and it aroused her. It would have been luscious if it weren't for that burning stink. She got unsteadily to her feet and made for the door at the end of the corridor. She had to get out of there, away from the fumes burning her nose. When she stepped outside, though, she was immediately assaulted with sharp, stinging shocks all over her skin, as if she was being attacked by a swarm of invisible wasps. She tried to endure and push forward. Freedom was on the other side of the mine, but the closer she got, the more incredible the pain. No longer wasp stings, but shocks from a live wire. She also began to feel physical force pushing her away from the mine that got stronger as she got closer. The salt. The air itself was full of fine particles, the cause of the horrid stinging sensation, and the mine, which was nothing but salt. "You will know when I've turned you," the vampire had said. It had waited for her so long because it couldn't get to her while she was imprisoned in the mine. It had to somehow coax them into bringing her to the laboratory. How, though? How had it made the Nazis do its bidding? She could no longer bear the stinging assault and ran back into the laboratory. The chlorine pain abated at once, simmering down to a burning sensation that felt like pins and needles on a foot that's fallen asleep. Hans Erlenbusch's voice. God help them if they've harmed her. She jumped and looked around but could see no one else nearby. She heard him utter in a string of curses, and then she realised that she wasn't hearing him with her ears. She could hear his words in her head. They're jumbled, babbling nature, indicating that he wasn't saying them aloud. They were the thoughts running through his mind. If she could see into the private musings of his mind, might she not also be able to influence them? Could that be how the vampire had gotten the Nazis to bring her from the poisonous salt mine to the relative safety of the laboratory? She heard Erlenbush's cry out in pain, this time with her ears. It excited her. Her pupils dilated, her nostrils flared. She turned back toward the laboratory to find her good friend Hans Erlenbush. Erlenbush's furious footsteps echoed along the walls of the laboratory building. Huffed, the bastard. Erlenbush had been halfway to Budapest before a sliver of doubt had sunk in, and he radioed ahead to find out he'd been tricked. God help them if they've harmed her. The experiment room was dark. Dr. Haft? There was no answer. It was completely still and quiet. Strangely, though, he didn't feel his usual dread. His first pre-conscious thought was overwhelming relief. He'd unknowingly tensed up everything, stomach, shoulders, legs, jaw. They relaxed all at once so quickly that a little squirt of piss shot into his trousers. Erlenbush took a step into the room and stumbled over something lying on the floor. He went sprawling, yelping when his wrist bent back painfully as he broke his fall. It took his eyes a moment to adjust, and then he saw Haft. He was lying on his side, facing away from Erlenbush. The collar of his white lab coat was stained with blood. All of Erlenbush's fear came rushing back in an instant. He knelt down and spoke Haft's name. In response, Haft only gurgled something unintelligible. He rolled Haft towards him, dreading what he would see. The doctor's body was heavy and limp like a corpse. The tracks of blood from the puncture wounds had dried on Haft's face, making it look in the dim light like raw meat. The needle had broken off from the syringe and was still sticking out of his eye, which was blood red and oddly wrinkled. Erlenbush realised to his horror that Haft's eyeball had deflated. Paralysed, deaf and blind in one eye, but left alive. "Kill me," Haft whispered. A bloody bubble burst from his lips as he said it, and bile rushed up out of Erlenbush's throat. Vomit splashed his shoes, mingling with the blood and shit on the floor. "Hans!" The word came right into his mind, insinuating itself in a primeval part of his brain, whispering along his nerve endings without need for her to speak or him to hear. Her voice was sweet and dark. In spite of everything, his cock stirred. "I am not the most beautiful woman you've ever seen." He turned. She stood silhouetted in the doorway. Her grey dress had slipped off to reveal one bare shoulder. She was no longer plain. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He was almost painfully hard. "Come to me." He went to her. Her eyes were the fathomless black of a lake at night. "I could tell you anything you'd like about vampires now." She spoke aloud, not in his mind. Her teeth moved against his throat. His hands found her lips and pulled her body against his. She was hot and her muscles had wrong, coiled feel, like a snake about to strike. "But I've decided to teach you only one thing." She put her hand on his crotch, her lips against his ear. "What it feels like to be helpless." She grabbed a fistful and tore. He screamed high and long. It fed something in her. She wanted more. Of his screams, of the smell of his blood. She not had the imagination to dream such an existence, power, strength greater than any human's. And my God, vengeance was so very, very sweet. "Give me his skin, daughter." The vampire stood in the doorway. She thought it had left her behind. Erlenbush's screams had simmered down to a sob. She had heard the vampire in her head, but she didn't know if Erlenbush could hear it as well. "All of it?" "No," Erlenbush wheezed, "please!" So he could hear. He knew what was in store for him. A tremor of pleasure shook her. She was no virgin. Her brother, in fact, the one who had sent her down this path, had deflowered her when she was just still a girl. It was why he had come back for her after he had turned, and it was why she hadn't thought twice about splitting his skull with an axe. His being turned into a vampire gave her all the excuse she needed. So no, she wasn't pure. Many of her encounters had been pleasurable, even with her own brother. She hated him for that, perhaps most of all, but none of her sexual experiences could compare to her anticipation of what was about to happen. She almost couldn't hold it against them, these Nazis. It was exhilarating to have someone incapacitated and in your complete control, and the knowledge that you could do anything you wanted with them and suffer no consequences. She felt like a god. "How do I do it?" she asked the vampire. "There is a spot on the human body. Here." It guided her hand to gather up a fistful of loose flesh. "No," Erlenbush pleaded. "Don't do this. I saved you from the mine, Morella." She leaned down close to his ear. "But I've come to know your soul, Hans. Be grateful. God may forgive your sins if your suffering is great enough." The vampire said, "If you pull it fast enough and hard, it will all come off in one piece." Erlenbush began to shriek mindlessly and thrash about. The vampire winced in pain, his ears shrinking away from the loud noise. "Silence him," it said, and Morella pulled fast and hard from the spot it had shown her. She was quite amazed when it worked. She held up a fistful of dripping skin. Erlenbush's final act on earth was an ear-splitting scream, choked off when the shock killed him. The vampire took the skin and draped it over itself like a shawl. Rivulets of blood ran down its mottled corpse flesh like tassels. "Now it will be possible to bear the salt." Haft groaned on the floor. "There's one for you." Morella regarded Haft with no indifference. "That one means nothing to me," she said. From the corridor beyond, "Dr. Erlenbush! Dr. Haft?" Morella smiled, her teeth growing sharper by the minute. "That one, though." "Dr. Erlenbush? Dr. Haft?" It appeared everyone was gone. Reichardt poked his head around several rooms and called out. No one was in the lab. He heard a small sound. He cocked his head and listened. There, a girl crying. He followed the sound, bringing him to a closed door. He gave it a push and it swung open slowly. The gypsy girl was huddled in the corner. He stepped into the room and locked the door. He unbuckled his belt. It made a satisfying slapping sound as it pulled through the loops. He wrapped it around his hands and pulled it taut. When she looked up, the first thing she would see was the belt and his fists. His lips parted in anticipation. She uncoiled herself. He backed away. Her body moved into a predatory crouch. He hit the door, which he'd been so careful to lock behind him. The Quantum Vampire. Preface. I am a writer and a painter devoted to the subject of myths, dreams, terror, superstition and the strange. I am currently working on a series of papers that focus on the gruesome events that occurred in Redacted National Park, Alberta, Canada, ranging from the years 2011 to 2017. Jacob Wingate is a person of interest who is highly sought after by the RCMP. He was a witness to a sight of otherworldly terror that, no doubt, forever changed him. His involvement in all of this is truly unique, and I will offer a glimpse into a world of darkness. This first series of papers will delve into the mythology that has persisted through the eons. Here be dragons. You are asked to imagine massive snow-capped mountain ranges that sweep the breathtaking landscape in every which way you happen to look. Visualize a high-altitude wind-swept steppe interspersed with turquoise lakes. This is the roof of the world, the Tibetan Plateau. Now imagine for a moment that it is a breezy and overcast spring afternoon. There is a child wrapped in double-layered robes who is stomping through the melting snow. That rambunctious child is me. The year was 1988, and this is where my lifelong obsession would begin. An obsession with things that should not exist. Things that stand defiant in our understanding of the world. Things that invoke mind-blasting terror on those who would gaze upon it with naive eyes. My foot had caught in a small opening in the ground, my forward momentum causing me to land on my hands and knees. I corrected myself, wiped off the snow and dirt off my clothing, and peered into the hole. Something had caught my attention. Stuck in the permafrost was an oddly shaped rock. Fishing out my pocket knife, I removed it from the frozen soil. The object was not a rock, but rather a bronze amulet. The amulet depicted a head and a face of a creature that resembled a man, but there was something distinctly inhuman about it. It was ghoulish and malevolent. I got the impression that this object was very old. A tremendous gust of wind nearly knocked me over backwards onto the ground. I quickly pocketed the amulet and made my way back to the monastery. My journey was in haste as the wind continued to accost me with its cold and bitterness, but it was the slowly increasing sense of dread that seemingly came out of nowhere. I felt as though I was being watched by someone. I stopped in my tracks and I glanced at my surroundings. Not a soul was in sight. Soon pictures began to form in my brain, images of ancient ruins from unknown point in time. In a recess, I glimpsed something that caused my heart to nearly leap from my chest. A draped form standing in the shadows. I could make out a face that was partially concealed by a hood that hung down at the brow. What I could see was skin that was pale like freshly fallen snow, with thin, cracked lips that curled back to reveal sharp teeth. And just as soon as the images blinked in my imagination, they vanished like any other fleeting thought. It wasn't until later that night I would bear witness to a grisly and nightmarish sight. I recall tossing and turning in my sleep. I kept hearing strange noises on the wind that never let up. I was jealous and frustrated that the others were sleeping so peacefully. I was feeling very thirsty, so I decided to go get some water. Just as I began to sit up, a tall and lanky shape emerged from the shadows. It was an emaciated thing in tattered robes whose face was concealed by a hood. I spotted two glimmering pinpoints of red lights in its sunken black eyes. I was frozen in my bed, hoping that the thing didn't spot me. I detected a strange low ringing noise in my ears, like tinnitus, and I swear to you, I could hear whispering. It was like the coffin chorus for the damned. A voice broke, though. "I know. You're awake." I was fully aware that it had an audience of one. I was frozen in place, petrified like a scared animal. It began feeding on the children. One by one it clamped its jaws onto their necks, carnivorous teeth plunging through tissue and drawing up blood. The grotesque sound of the feeding, then sudden opening of the victim's eyes, confused and terrified at what was happening. And after it was done, it proceeded to swiftly break each of their necks. Their heads were rotated completely around with sickening cracks. Tears were rolling down my cheeks, and the sudden realization that I was the last one hit me like a storm. I wanted to scream. I wanted to race out of the monastery. I wanted to escape. It raised a bony finger to its lips. Shh. The looming shape approached and knelt right down next to me, moving its head towards me. I became conscious of a distinctive metallic odour, mould and soil. The red shimmering pinpoints in its eyes dilated like an eclipse. It stretched out a pale hand and opened its palm. A grave and disembodied voice commanded me, "You have something of mine. Give it back to me, little one." With trembling hands, I reached under my pillow and withdrew the bronze amulet and placed it onto the waiting palm. The thing closed its fingers around it and stood up. It vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving me alone in the dark with my dead friends. Vampires. They are everywhere you look, in movies and television, literature and art, even video games and Halloween costumes. All around the world there is a belief in vampires. Ever since the dawn of time, humans have believed in such things. There are so many ancient legends, so many variations of the vampire creature. Some are shambling ghouls who dig themselves up from the ground to feed on the living. Others are glamorous sex symbols who charm their victims. Some can even turn into bats or other animals. Legend would tell you that they burst into flames when exposed to the sun. Staking them through the heart is a surefire way to eliminating them, and that they dislike silver and garlic. We are to believe that they cower and fright from religious icons and prayers, or, to prevent the recently deceased from returning, rocks were crudely shoved into their mouth before burial. None of these are accurate or correct. Even if you were able to destroy such a creature, their essence would be carried on in the wind, only to find another host to inhabit. Quantum vampires are an outside alien consciousness that can inhibit a physical form and use it as a vehicle for its own purposes, feeding off the living things to sustain its hold in existence. But it is impossible to understand the motives of the creatures from the spaces between and what they truly want. From my research, I have found that there are 13 that exist in the world, scattered across the planet. There is no secret vampire society or underground cult, or, if anything, they're isolated and highly territorial. While it is true that there are people out there who worship and venerate them as their deities, there is no alliance of some kind. They are the predator, and we are the prey. They want to draw our blood like a crimson lotus and lap it up with their tongues. Law of the land. Just imagine for a moment that you are a time traveller, a visitor through time and space. Prairie bedrock built of layers of sediment accumulated over a period of tens of millions of years. At one point, they lay submerged beneath an enormous shallow sea. Speaking of geologic terms, a recent cataclysm, the Rocky Mountains of the West pushed upwards into the sky like otherworldly monoliths. Eventually land would emerge, a tropical land where the mighty Tyrannosaurus and other massive beasts existed. However, there would be a time where things changed. That was when the ice would arrive. In the past billion years, there have been 3 ice ages, at least. Each one roughly lasting 100,000 years. The ice would advance and retreat. In the last ice age, giant sheets of ice would carry massive rocks and debris to the north of the Rocky Mountains, eroding and smothering the land. You would hardly see the land. Instead, a vast ocean of ice and snow would greet you. Then, about 12,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. The land was carved by raging glacial waters, creating lakes and rivers. In present time, the beautiful prairies are the result of such a lengthy process. A landscape that consists of gorgeous forests, grasslands, hills and valleys, canyons and wind-smothered hoodoos, and colourful cliffs that reveal different sediment layers. One can see the mighty buffalo grazing on luscious grass, powerful grizzlies and black bears journeying through the wilds, coyotes and wolves running about in packs, and stealthy mountain lions stalking the dense brush. It is a primitive landscape that can haunt your imagination with its elegance. It is known that First Nations people have lived in what is now Canada for at least 15,000 years, although there is evidence that suggests they may have arrived even earlier. For thousands of years, nomadic hunting people followed big animals for food in their desperate struggle to survive. Many groups of these wanderers coalesced into tribes with their own ways of life, their own cultures and beliefs. This, of course, serves as a backdrop to something which defies mankind's understanding of the natural world. There is something that exists within the Rocky Mountains and foothills of Alberta. Something that has existed for an unfathomable period of time. There is an oral tradition that tells the legend of 2 tribes who were at war with one another over sacred land. One day, the aggressor tribe attacked the keepers of the sacred land. Big Bear, the tribal chief of the keepers, and his mighty warriors were able to drive off the attackers, but many of his people were killed in the attack. His wife and his son were among the dead. Over time, Big Bear became a diminished man who was heartbroken for the loss of his loved ones. He approached a shaman called Stands Alone, who wanted to end the war once and for all. Stands Alone knew of an ancient and forbidden ritual that would bring an end to their desperate situation. On a crisp winter night, Big Bear retrieved the body of his deceased son, Little Crow, and with Stands Alone, the journey into the foothills where a circle of standing stones have stood since the time of the mist. Little Crow was placed into the soil at the centre of the stones. Soon, great spirit lights began dancing in the sky so high above. The 2 of them made their way out into the foothills. Stands Alone explained to Big Bear that one of the great old ones would descend from the heavens and inhabit the body of Little Crow, bringing him back to life and to end the war. Afterwards, the great old one would return to the sky, and Little Crow would be returned. 7 days would go by. Big Bear's tribe continued to be attacked by their enemies, losing more of their people. The tribal chief began to lose faith in Stands Alone, believing that the war would never end and his son would never return. Then, one day the attack stopped. There was no more desecration of the sacred land, no more loss of his tribe. The tribal chief and the shaman ventured into the enemy territory. What they discovered was a sight of forbidden horror. Men, women, old and young were all found dead. The look of terror was frozen on their faces. There were bite marks on all of their bodies. The blood drained from them, and their heads twisted around. Only one stood in the falling snow among the dead. It was Little Crow. A great joy overtook his father's heart, and he stepped towards the boy. Stands Alone stopped Big Bear. The shaman was concerned. They looked at the little boy who stood in silence watching them, with what appeared to be restrained hostility. Big Bear shouted for his son. "Little Crow!" Something was wrong with the child. His eyes were black like the night sky with red starlight in them. His skin was unusually pale. The boy's stomach was bulging and bloated, sloshing with its contents. The boy had tilted his head and stared directly at his father and grinned. His teeth were sharp like arrow tips. The boy spoke, but it was not his voice. "Little Crow is in here, but it is not he who responds." Stands Alone got in between father and son. He knew something was wrong. Their enemies were slain. The war was over. The task completed. The great old one should have released the boy. "In the name of our ancestors, I command you to leave the boy. You must return him to his father, and you must go back." Little Crow snarled and clenched his blood-soaked hands. "I am older than man. I am older than the mountains and rivers. I am older than your world. I am eternal. Do not call things into your realm that you cannot send back." Little Crow pounced on the shaman and bit down on his neck, drinking his very life and snapping the old man's neck. Big Bear attempted to restrain the boy, but Little Crow threw him down into the snow. "I am the infinite thirst. I am the darkness from beyond the stars. I will return to your tribe and satiate my hunger, and you will watch." And so Little Crow returned to the tribe later that night, dragging his screaming father by his feet. The boy, who was being driven by the great old one, began attacking everyone. Unbeknownst to Little Crow, there was another shaman who foresaw this. A box was constructed from granite and wood. It was then filled with soil from the standing stones. Soon, the song of beating drums and chanting men calling for their ancestors to aid them in time of need filled the air. Just as the sun began rising in the morning sky, Little Crow was blinded by it and forced into his prison of stone and wood and sealed within. It was hidden in a dark cave at the base of a mountain and sealed away. 300 years ago, a group of French alchemists who were obsessed with immortality heard of the legend of Little Crow and began seeking out his burial site. They made a black pilgrimage into the Rocky Mountains. During their journey, they performed a hymn. They discovered the sarcophagus that was hidden away for thousands upon thousands of years and loosed him into the world. Little Crow was free once more. The great old one now haunts the wilderness, always questing for new horrors. It's interesting to note that several fascinating finds were discovered throughout Redacted National Park in the year 1985. A mass grave containing vast amounts of human remains was unearthed. There was also a strange coffin made of stone slabs and wood found within the mountains. A curious archaeological discovery indeed. Unfortunately, there were several bizarre deaths that happened shortly after the discovery. The site of the coffin was in a cave where the soil was teeming with an unknown species of protozoa that had ill effects on the people who first entered the cave. Swift Runner and the Mountain Lion. The never-ending flow of time would continue and man would cross paths once more with the eldritch evil. It was December 1874 when Swift Runner and the frontiersman named Boone were tracking down a man-eating mountain lion responsible for several deadly attacks at a nearby outpost. It was a grey, overcast day with light snowfall. Armed with flint-rock rifles, the two men followed a trail of bloody footprints into the forest. Hours went by and the sun was starting to set. They found a clearing in the trees. In the middle of this snow-covered field they found the mountain cat perched atop a large quartzite rock. The mountain lion was staring down at them with its yellow eyes. It was watching them with predatory curiosity, one might expect from such an animal. The wind suddenly picked up in strength, causing the snow to drift. Swift Runner and Boone shouldered their rifles and took aim. Just as they were about to open fire, they were both distracted by a low ringing noise in their ears, followed by disembodied whispering coming from the surrounding trees. The ringing noise increased in volume and intensity, causing both men to fall to their knees. The cougar seemingly took advantage of the situation and clambered off the rock and tackled Boone and locked its powerful jaws into Boone's face and began wrenching his head back and forth violently. The man's smothered screams echoed through the snowy forest. The world began going dark for Swift Runner, who was crying in agony from the ringing noise in his ears. Soon, the fading world began to return to view. The ringing in his ears subsided, and the whispering stopped. Boone was gone, and so was the big cat. All that remained was blood and the rifle in the snow. The snowfall became even more heavy now. Visibility was becoming worse, and the biting wind increased with savage gusts. A moving shape appeared in the distance, moving towards him like a terrifying apparition. Swift Runner was not alone in the secluded field. It was child-sized. It was gaunt, with skin pulled tightly over its frame, like a frozen and mummified corpse. The malignant thing spoke to him. "My pet has developed a taste for the flesh of humans. It is going to be long winter, after all." Swift Runner trembled from the cold and the terror that stood before him. "Do you know what I am?" Swift Runner stared at the creature, his heart and mind racing, desperately holding on to his sanity. "You are a Wendigo, the spirit who feeds on men." Swift Runner responded. He broke his gaze and stared down at the snow-covered ground. "Perhaps I am. What I do know is that I am forever bound to this land. The mountains and valleys, even the very soil we are standing on. I must return to my site of origin. It is that time again where certain stars are visible and a ritual of utmost importance must be completed. If you wish to continue your existence, you will help me cross the nearby river. The currents cause this vessel to foam at the mouth, among other discomforts. Quite an irritant." Swift Runner would eventually return to the outpost, a man that would forever be changed. A few years later, during a particularly cold and miserable winter, he murdered his wife and children. He cooked and ate their flesh. Eventually, he would be arrested and brought to trial. He claimed that he was possessed by the spirit of the Wendigo and was compelled to commit these horrible acts. He insisted on his story being true right to the moment he was executed. Finally, we are done wandering through the past and return to the present. The following papers will deal with a new beginning, the 13th vampire.